There's a reason the separation of church and state is such an important aspect of a functioning government. Religion, despite what some would believe, is highly malleable, with corruption being far more easily attainable. For untold millennia across the vast universes that have existed, there is always someone in a fancy robe speaking the word of God in order to attain greater power for themselves and for those they deem worthy. The state is also highly malleable, but in the sense of who is able to serve, to represent the interest and needs of the people, to ensure the social contract's continuation. Unfortunately, this too can be corrupted, but such corruption can be prevented by a proactive and engaged citizenry, reminding politicians who they work for. Yet, when it comes to the Republic, for a period of 1,000 years, that separation broke down entirely. It brought about a time worse than any other in galactic history since the passing of the Rakatan Infinite Empire, exceeded only by two of the most devastating wars that would come in later millennia. More importantly, this was the true cause of the Clone Wars. Religion can be a beautiful thing when allowed to act as it's supposed to, not a tool for control or a method of gaining power, but as something meant to bring comfort, wellness, care, and sometimes enlightenment. A common theme for mortals that occurs again and again within the Great Circle. The Paideia, like any other religion, began in such a manner. It was a monotheistic faith that worshipped a deity known as the Goddess, who brought safety and reward to those who were pure. It was founded on Coruscant, likely in the depths of the Undercity, where its message would be desperately needed, where resentment and pain could be redirected to an outlet. I imagine that they no doubt originally did great good, feeding the poor, trying to help the weak and downtrodden. But over centuries of being in the muck, you could say, in the dark, in the dank confines of the Undercity, seeing nothing but filth and degradation, how people were treated, and always needing help, something fundamentally broke within them. They began to take purity more seriously as more and more aliens arrived on the capital world. Remember that during this time, Coruscant and the rest of the core worlds were mainly made up of humans. They relied on each other and could understand one another. Even if there was some strife and difference of opinion, they were still fundamentally the same, human. But as aliens came, as their needs had to be met, needs that were more complex, more different, the members of the early Paideia found themselves becoming disgusted. Then came the calls to clamp down on corruption, for people to police themselves to remain incorruptible by not interacting with these outsiders, to purge unredeemable elements so purity could reign. The most ironic part? Those calls weren't coming from the Paideia, at least not first. They came from the Coruscanti themselves, the very people the Paideia were taking care of. Because resources were dwindling. There wasn't enough to go around for everyone. Regardless of how hard the Paideia tried, they couldn't provide for everyone. And yet more and more aliens were arriving. They gathered in the Undercity in their millions, choking the very air of the world beneath, all while politicians, their representatives, ignored them, even as the Paideia drowned in bodies. And in that instance, something had to change. They watched each new species from the Outer Rim into the Republic, forcing more changes, more differences, more of everything they couldn't handle. If change wouldn't come from the upper levels, then they would need to reach up and do it themselves. That was what caused their change. They began to exclude beings, specifically all aliens, deeming them impure as humanocentrism ran rampant through the Paideia. The ideals that made them a good religion died that day, and they became a cult, not led by a person, but by a belief, an ideal. Leaders came and go, but the idea remained. Humanity was pure. To stretch out one's hand to grasp the power to change things was never a simple process. The cult had garnered significant power in the Undercity, but it was useless without political strength behind it. In rebellion, any attempt to change things by force would have been immediately cracked down upon by the Coruscanti security forces. But the cult, no doubt, had allies within those ranks. It hardly mattered. They had few weapons, and though they could grow an endless tide of followers at the security forces, many were too weak from hunger or were unruly and unreliable. And so the Paideia decided that subversion would work best to gain influence. Their target was the Coruscant Merchants Guild. Why precisely they chose it? We don't know actually. Perhaps it was to alleviate their food issues, or perhaps it was simply due to accessibility. After all, anyone can be a merchant if they are savvy enough. One of these members was Conscious. Had it not been for the cult, the name Conscious would have never become prominent within the Republic. He would have merely lived his life, profited from trade, and likely retired to a moon he owned somewhere in the galaxy. Instead, this man would become the beginning of a dynasty, with far-reaching implications unknown for millennia to come. During his time among the Merchants Guild, he gained a reputation of fairness. Like all merchants, he loved credits, but he didn't cheat customers for greater profit, nor did he scheme against his adversaries, and neither did he fall for the traps set against him. Or he was smart, savvy, and possessing impeccable business sense. He held a staunch stance against corruption and an intolerance for those who didn't share his high standards. He treated customers as people rather than merely sources of income, made them feel welcome, and didn't bleed them dry with unfair practices. This made him a very well-loved figure very quickly in the public eye, to the point that the people of Coruscant themselves made him the representative in the Senate. His every word was honey to the ears of his constituents, and nary a lie crossed his lips. Better still, Conscious kept his word and followed it with action as he struck at the heart of corruption. Now, with one of their own in the Senate, the cult began to plot against the same Chancellor of the Republic. Through a series of strategic political maneuvers and underground assistance, they had him impeached in a vote of no confidence. Yet, the most ironic part is that who the Chancellor was. His name was Ursula, a Bothan, which makes this the first time Bothans caused the collapse of galactic civilization. Thank you very much, Borsphalia. Borsphalia will follow millennia later during the Yuuzhan Vong War. Truly, nothing new exists under the stars. After the impeachment of Ursula, Conscious won in a landslide to become the new Supreme Chancellor, bringing the Pious Dia's ambitions to fruition. As for the former Supreme Chancellor, well, let's just say there was no way this group of humanocentric insanities was going to let an alien live to continue tainting the memory of the Chancellorship. Shortly after the election, days later in fact, the former Supreme Chancellor was found dead in his apartment, thanks to a secret society of poisoners hired by the cult to tie up loose ends. With one of their own now as Supreme Chancellor, the Pious Dia swiftly gained full control of the political and economic machinery of the Republic's government. Very shortly thereafter, they purged all their opponents from power, most falling from windows, suffering shell accidents, speeder crashes, or succumbing to bad vintages of wine. The list went on and on. It took a few generations for this to fully play out, but by the end, most important bureaucratic positions were reserved exclusively for cult members. Within 2 or 3 generations, these positions became hereditary, entrenching their influence through a culture of nepotism, a common symptom whenever a cult takes power. Always the same, and it's always pathetic. By 11,500 BBY, the Republic was nothing more than a shadow of its former glory, truly a fallen state. But before any of the work to entrench generational power for the cult, there had to be a reason why it would be allowed without anyone noticing or even opposing it. It would be in 11,965 BBY, a full 2 years after the election of Supreme Chancellor Conscious, that the reason would be revealed. In a Chinese war entry, I hinted that the Hutts feared a war against the Republic that would not come for millennia, having seen the fury that could be unleashed when the Republic nearly scorched the Titan cluster to ashes in revenge. That had scared the Hutts, even at the height of their power, but much had changed since that time. Remember that the Chinese War had come to an end in 23,900 BBY. Between that time and the First Pious Dia Crusade, the Hutts had grown far weaker, having immolated themselves in a massive civil war known as the Hutt Cataclysms. While the cause was unknown, it didn't matter, for the result was the Hutt Empire shattered into 1,000 pieces that had to be picked up. Their homeworld of Varl was devastated. Ancient Hutt colonies rendered lifeless wastelands, and the Hutts themselves were forced to relocate to Evokar, which would become known as Nal Hutta. It had been so terrible and destructive that the Hutts outright rejected war and territorial conquest as methods of lesser species, and instead formed the Council of Elders. They embraced a new philosophy known as Jar, which taught that fierce competition between the clans was how the weak were winnowed from the species. Suffice to say, the Hutts frightened themselves so badly that they became pseudo-pacifists. One could only imagine how they felt when the First Pious Dia Crusade was launched against them. Supreme Chancellor Conscious sanctioned a preemptive strike against the Hutts. Republic forces from the sliced portion of the Mid-Rim advanced beyond the Republic's borders towards Hutt space. The attack forces moved rimward along the Uthman Pabel hyperlane, forming the spear tip that pushed into Hutt space. These attacks were swiftly followed by 2 other assault lines, originating from the Republic's Ordnance Regional Depots, a network of forward military and scouting bases established during the height of the Republic. 2 such worlds lay beyond the Republic's borders, or the Wyland launched forces to strike Hutt-aligned worlds such as Troidaria, while Ord Winder pushed deeper into Hutt space to strike at their planets. While the Hutts eventually managed to push back the First Crusade, it came only after the devastation of the remaining worlds. They were able, for the time being, to retain a strong defensive network, one that would soon be challenged again by the Republic in the Second Crusade that followed. This was not the end. After the rise of Consciuspex II in 11,947 BBY to the position of Supreme Chancellor following his father's 40th year rule, another crusade was launched nearly 8 years into his term. The Third Crusade struck at the southern reaches of Hutt space, followed 19 years later in 11,920 BBY by the Fourth Crusade. Each targeted the Hutts, wearing down their forces further with each campaign as the cult continued its trend of religious persecution. But there was a problem. This much the Jedi Order knew. Ossus, the Jedi homeworld, lay very close to where the Crusades were taking place, though none directly targeted the Jedi or the Tynese cluster. That didn't make the Order blind to what was happening. The Third Crusade revealed something deeply troubling about the conflicts that were being waged. Worlds that were not allied with the Hutts, and even non-human Republic member worlds, were also attacked. Specifically, Sneath and Shalata were targeted by the Third Crusade. Their populations were devastated, and even the near-human Shalatans, universally respected and renowned for their spiritual order, the Shalatan Adepts, were not spared. They were treated as harshly as any Hutt ally, if not worse. What had begun as a war against military targets had become something closer to purges. This disturbed the Order greatly. Reports from Jedi stationed within the Republic spoke of a change in attitude, alien members no longer being welcome on Coruscant. Government officials thinly veiled their contempt for them, and even human Jedi were viewed with suspicion. Danger sense flared constantly within buildings that should have been safe. It felt as if they too were being targeted, that their presence was no longer welcome. The answers they received from the Republic were less than satisfactory when they made the inquiries. Or still, Jedi who managed to get close and seek answers found themselves almost courted. The cult's ideals seeped into every conversation, infecting them subtly and persistently, but it became too much. And so the Jedi did something that they could not do in the aftermath of the new Sith Wars. They cut ties. They extracted themselves from the Republic, retreated to Ossus, and declared that they were no longer subject to Republic rule. How that must have stung the pious Thea to think the Jedi Order would refuse what they believed would be the obvious truth, that humans were superior. No doubt Consciuspex II would have loved to invade Ossus to unleash the full might of the Republic Navy and bring the Jedi to their heel, but history had shown that attacking Ossus was signing one's own death warrant, and so he allowed it, because he had no choice. Yet, to his surprise, the Jedi were not a cult. They were trained, taught, studied, allowing free will to exist among their students. They did not bind individuals to paths that they did not wish to walk. Anyone could join the Jedi and leave it, facing only the natural consequences of such choices, consequences the Order itself would never impose. Thus, when the Jedi recused themselves and withdrew from the Republic, shutting their doors for centuries, not all followed. A smaller group of dissident Jedi Knights allied with the Pious Dia cause. They abandoned Ossus, their homes, their family, their friends, for a desolate world of craggy rocks and dead trees, shrouded in dense yellow fog, Garn. There they had become the Order of the Terrible Glare, and aided their new masters with fanaticism rivaling even the most devoted Pious Dia. For the first time, the cult possessed something that they never believed possible, their own Jedi. But this was not the Jedi Order's only response. While the Order as a whole remained withdrawn, some Jedi could not ignore the suffering inflicted by the cult. Their sense of right and wrong would not allow it, and as a result, they acted without the Council's blessing. They left Ossus, just as many Jedi would do in the future, in order to fight back. With the advent of the Fourth Crusade, the Republic's borders expanded as territory was seized from Hutt-aligned species, going as far as Delacrix, Niban, Quen, and Toydaria. These worlds brought great treasure and reward. It was not enough. Thousands of Pious Dia scouts and privateers pushed beyond the frontier in the search for more worlds to conquer. As the war fronts advanced, the cult believed that it was finally time to purge the galaxy of alien filth that had taken so much from humanity. Within the Senate chambers, non-human senators were rounded up and arrested in witch hunts. Commissars were attached to every military unit to expose heretics and apostates, those who did not conform to the faith of the goddess. These beings were brought before inquisitions, special religious courts, and tribunals where they were tried and executed in mass proceedings. Dissidents, known as the proscribed, were stripped of civil liberties, had their assets nationalized, and saw their social mobility severely limited if they were lucky. Though this was confined to the core worlds and the colonies, it still constituted tens of billions, and not hundreds of billions of beings subject to these indignities. The power of ancient republic dynasties, both guilty and innocent, were shattered to ensure none could rise against the cult. But even that was just the beginning. What came next can be summed up in a single sentence: suffer not the alien to live. In 11,884 BBY, 36 years after the Fourth Crusade, the Pious Dia turned their attention to other alien worlds and sects within the Outer Rim, many of whom had been Republic members for millennia. They launched the Great Northern Crusade against the Zabrak and Ithorian species. Like a tide, their forces swept through the region, launching from Ord Mantell. They targeted Ithor, while Ord Contral and Ord Maglumine struck Iridonia. Though records of devastation was incomplete, the damage was significant enough to cripple both species for centuries, if not millennia. 93 years later, the Republic launched another crusade, the Crusade of the Wilds, in 11,791 BBY. Departing from Ord Cetris and Ord Marsaxto, it seized territory north of the Permelian trade route, while targeting humans accused of alien sympathies. It was during this time that fleeing humans discovered Presfeld 4 as a secret colony, and later ages it would house the galaxy's premier military academy. But at that time, it was the only safe haven for those wrongfully targeted. These actions did not go unnoticed. The increasing violence of the Crusades eventually sparked the Sixth Alsalcan conflict as a result. Alsalcan had always been a rival to Coruscant for millennia. Since 17,000 BBY, it had attempted to usurp Coruscant's predominant role in the galaxy, believing that it should have been the capital of the Republic. It was just as grand and splendorous as its rival, economically powerful, with proud people, and a vibrant culture. Each time, however, it failed because the world and its people were fighting only for themselves. That would change in 11,820 BBY. Alsalcan had watched as Coruscant fell under the control of the Pious Dia, and saw how its citizens and allies were treated. The disgust felt by the Alsalki was visceral. Of course, those in higher positions on Alsalcan also recognized this as an opportunity to gain support needed to replace Coruscant. After all, it was good business, morally and politically. And what could be better than that? In response to the heinous actions of Coruscant, Alsalcan and much of the Axis territory loyal to Alsalcan took action. Worlds along the Permelian trade route that were threatened by the Pious Dia pleaded for Alsalki protection, which was granted. Thus began the Sixth Alsalcan conflict, a vicious and brutal war between the Pious Dia Republic and the Alsalcan-led Axis, with secret lines of communication open between the Alsalcan and the victims of the Crusade. For centuries, this alliance checked the Pious Dia Republic, tying up valuable resources and assets that might otherwise have been used to attack additional worlds and purge more aliens. Though the war would eventually end, had inflicted deep wounds upon the Republic. With the loss of nearly a third of its territory and more plans to join Alsalcan by the day, the Pious Dia needed a new strategy, a new weapon. As the saying goes, ask and ye shall receive. The Republic Navy became the Pious Dia's stronghold, and a new class of vessel entered service, one that would prove essential in sustaining expansion and securing their worlds against the Alsalcan alliance. These were the Citadel ships, massive warships that functioned as both fortresses and religious temples, larger than any vessels previously constructed by the Republic. Each were crewed by the descendants of naval personnel who had been converted to the cult and supported by men of war. Capital ships built for broadside exchanges meant to tear lesser vessels apart. They carried bi-wing snub fighters to provide atmospheric and air superiority, and transported millions of troops to enemy worlds. But the Pious Dia did not solely rely on these new warships. They invested heavily in the construction of new military outposts designated to protect human settlers from hostile alien threats. This further deepened interspecies tensions as anti-alien crusades forced mass exoduses into Hutt space. The entire Rimwood slice became a militarized zone dominated by war profiteers, with new Ords acting as bases for the Republic naval units and the Pious Dia missionaries launching military and religious expeditions into the frontier, driving ever deeper into the darkness to bring the goddess's light. Soon, millions of worlds fell under the Pious Dia rule. and their ranks swelled as thousands of species were forcibly converted. These worlds were isolated to enforce cold control, with interstellar travel heavily restricted except for those who gained favor, most often through military service. All this bloodshed, forced conversion, destruction, suffering only bred resentment. Quickly, a new movement began to form within the ranks of the Paizdea themselves. A word emerged that would change the galaxy and restore the Republic as it once was. Renunciate. For 800 years, the Jedi remained on Ossus, fully aware of what transpired beyond their borders. More and more their order left to aid species harmed by the Crusades, acting without permission as the will of the Force guided them to their own destinies. The order as a whole, however, remained silent by choice, saying nothing beyond Ossus's atmosphere. Every day was filled with fierce debate whether they should pick up the sword against the Republic or allow the madness to continue. A madness first born from the Taiwanese and allowed to fester for centuries while the Order deliberated. The Republic had become a tool of the dark side itself, turning inwards and hurting its own people with increasing zeal. Still, the Jedi did nothing until a sign came. You see, there are very few species in the galaxy the Jedi respected, and fewer still capable of drawing them from purposeful isolation. But it was something else entirely when the very species upon which I had built their entire philosophy, the Kalmasi, made a request. Their teachings had been defended in the First Great Schism and held close during the Chinese War and every conflict since. It would be 11,100 BBY that the Kalmasi visited Ossus, and on that day, the Jedi ended their recusal. The Jedi swiftly collaborated with the Kalmasi and the Alsalki to engineer a schism within the Paizdea. They spread a secret heresy whose followers became known as renunciates. Among them was Republic Admiral Piers Predu, who had discovered Prespel 4 nearly 30 years later. The plant became a base for the renunciate naval officers plotting to overthrow the Paizdea Republic. 3 years later, the plan was set into motion as the hand of the light side rose again. Thus began the 7th Alsalkan conflict. As one, the renunciates within the Republic Navy rose up as the skirmish was revealed, sparking a brutal civil war between them and the faithful. The conflict raged across the Republic, leaving no region untouched. Forward worlds were ravaged, generation ships destroyed, and government centers laid to waste across the length and breadth of space. Alsalki forces struck at the Paizdea fortresses on Fondor, Syria, Ixalar, Ord Merit, and Ord Karita, supported by Jedi strike forces and allied alien forces, such as the Duros, the Hercules, and even the Hutts. These bastions were reduced to rubble. At Ord Karita, Paizdea forces faced an enemy that they never anticipated: the Republic's Rocket Jumper Elite Advanced Unit, descendants of the elite soldiers who descended from above on jetpacks, outmaneuvering and devastating enemy formations before they could even respond. The conflict escalated into all-out war as the Paizdea-led Republic counterattacked, but after centuries of oppression and brutality, the bulk of the Republic Navy defected to the Jedi-led alliance, weakening the cult significantly. Even so, the Citadel ships kept them in the fight, forming fleets that continued battling the alliance. For a full year, space burned as the Cathedral ships unleashed enough firepower to deter assaults on their territory. The alliance pressed on, using the Force to guide strikes deeper into enemy space, targeting the Cathedral ships themselves. These vessels were the closest thing to Star dreadnoughts of their era, but unfortunately destroying one often allowed others to counterattack. Supreme Chancellor Conscispec 19 had been evacuated to the fleet, his flagship protected at all costs. He was more than willing to let the galaxy burn if he could not rule it. The faithful fought with unmatched zeal, but even that went too far for those who remained neutral. At last, the Bureau of Ships and Services acted. Coordinating with the Alliance, they secretly seeded Cathedral ships with rogue navigational computer codes. Were prepared for when the Alliance gathered its forces at Uquine, baiting the faithful into attack. Just before the jump, the Bureau transmitted the activation signal. In a single instant, more than half of the Cathedral fleet vanished, lost in hyperspace, most emerging in deep space. The navigational computers wiped and hyperdrives disabled. Communications dead. The crews would starve, and the lucky ones would die out quickly. The remaining Paizdea fleets arrived at Uquine only to find itself outgunned and under assault. As escort vessels were destroyed, Jedi strike teams boarded the Flame of Synthara, capturing Supreme Chancellor Conscispec 19 and ending the Paizdea's rule. 38. A number rarely spoken, yet vital. Over 1,000 years, the Paizdea had launched 38 crusades in the pursuit of purity, absolution, and power. But at last, after the suffering of billions, the loss of culture, and untold death, they were over. With the end of the Pius Dia era, Conscious 19 was tried and imprisoned. The Supreme Chancellorship passed to Jai Grandmaster Biel Doctavius, ushering in the Doctavius era, a 2,000-year age of reconstruction for the Republic. This period also marked a lasting change in Republic naval traditions, made by Admiral Paris Pardu, who reclaimed honor by aiding in the cult's overthrow. But this was not the end of the story. For once a society is exposed to an idea, it is difficult to purge it entirely. For 1,000 years, the Pius Dia ruled the Republic, infecting every facet with humanocentric ideology. Though the cult itself was exterminated shortly after its fall, the beliefs lingered beneath the surface. Human high culture became widely accepted in the core worlds, something unseen since the Republic's earliest days, since the Pius Dia era. Tensions between the human-dominated core and the alien rimward territories lingered for millennia. The continued existence of the Ords served as a daily reminder of what happened in the past, as the core worlds looked down upon the Outer Rim, viewing it as lesser. A war between the core worlds and the Outer Rim was inevitable. Not because of Palpatine, not because of his manipulations, or because he was using the Force to control people like puppets on strings, but because the fuse had already been lit thousands of years ago. It is a fuse that would continue on. The Clone Wars was a proxy that Palpatine used in order to become the Emperor, but that never was the true war that would eventually come between the two. Because when the true conflict comes, it will not be due to one person trying to manipulate all sides to gain power. It will be because the core worlds never learn, and the Outer Rim never forgets or forgives.